Hello, my name is Rob Good, and welcome to Shit I Have to Teach in 20 Minutes, a podcast for history teachers and anyone who wants a quick dose of history. In each episode, my colleague Eric Hahn and I interview a historian about their scholarship, asking them to identify the most important concepts they think teachers should share with their students about the topic for the day. And we hope that you are sharing this podcast with other folks out there. We know that teachers rarely get access to phenomenal historians and cutting edge scholarship. And so please help us by sharing it widely with your friends. If you like it, give us a review, hopefully a 5-star review, because that will help it land in other people's message boxes and they will be able to hear this wonderful information as well. So, Eric, what are we going to learn about today?
Right. So if you like the podcast, share it. But if you don't like it, my name is George. Well, Rob, today we're lucky. We're going to hear about the late Qing Dynasty in China, the last dynasty in that country, an area that experienced about 4,000 years of dynastic rule. It is an important topic for Chinese history and world history. And for my students, the big question for that time period was, what happened? China was at one point arguably the most powerful empire in the world. Why does dynasties rise? Why do dynasties fall?
Yeah, well, I want to know what happened, and I am young enough to be one of your students, so I will take their excitement about that topic. Who's our guest today? I think we have somebody who's already visited with us, correct?
We do have somebody, but you could be one of my students, right? If I started teaching when I was about 7 years old, that's great. Today, we are fortunate to have Dr. Dan Barish with us. He is a history professor at Baylor University, and his focus is on the cultural, political, and intellectual world of the 19th century and the transition from empire to nation in China. Dan is currently working on a couple of exciting projects, the first of which is Empire's Last Servants, the 1904 class of civil examination candidates and networks of knowledge in modern China. It examines the social production of knowledge across the 1911 revolutionary divide in China. The second is the imperial politics of life and death in modern China. It explores changes to a variety of life cycle rituals in the Qing imperial family over the course of the 19th century. I know these works are not yet published. However, he does have a published book, which is a prequel to those others. So depending upon the time of year you listen to this, it may be out. I cannot wait to read these publications soon. I hope I speak for history teachers when I say we appreciate you sharing this research, Dr. Dan Barish.
My absolute pleasure.
And I can't believe you came back after you sat down with us for 15 minutes the last time, but thank God. Our opening question is always, what would you say are the most important concepts that teachers should teach and students should learn, particularly about the decline of the Qing Dynasty?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And, to be upfront, what I'm about to say in about 15 minutes is a solid 5 weeks of classes in my upper level Chinese history seminar. So
enroll at Baylor. That's go take Dr. Barish's classes at Baylor.
Right.
Exactly. But I think sort of the first key thing is a decision about when to start, and particularly when to not start. So the first thing I want to emphasize is don't start your discussion or your analysis of the fall of the Qing with the Opium Wars and the arrival of the West. This is sort of the way we used to do it, where modern China starts with the arrival of the modern West, and traditional China, dynastic China, falls because it is incompatible with Western modernity. We don't do this anymore. This type of analysis, this type of framework really sort of makes it difficult for students to see a lot of the really important patterns across the 19th century that are critical to the fall of the Qing. So once we know, okay, let's not start with the Opium Wars and the arrival of the West, the question is, well, when do we want to start when we're talking about the fall, the decline of the Qing? And one of the sort of really interesting options here that I think is very helpful is actually to start with the 18th century expansion of empire, which creates some of the difficult conditions that the 19th century state will struggle to deal with. And one of the reasons why we like to do this is because actually in 1799, we get this really acute observer, the Chinese scholar official named Hong Liangji, who writes to the emperor warning about a lot of the coming dangers. So we have an explosion of China's population, but now a lack of arable or farmable land. We have growing corruption around the country, a growing sort of disconnection or alienation between the government officials and the people that they're supposed to be serving. And so he warns of coming uprisings, coming rebellions that are growing out of all of these forces and all of these dynamics around the turn of the 19th century. And it turns out that he is prescient. A lot of these things come to fruition, that China in the 19th century will be beset by domestic rebellion, by tremendous famine, struggles to find more arable land and keep up with the population growth. Now, that doesn't at all mean that the 19th century is one of just constant decline and stagnation. That's not at all what happens. But what it does mean is that a lot of the sort of energy of reform that we'll see doesn't take place at the imperial center. It takes place all around the country. So start your story of the decline of the Qing, not with the arrival of the West, but actually perhaps with the China's official Hong Liangji and his warning.
There was that's interesting to me that the lack of arable land. So the population was growing and the territory was expanding that fast that population couldn't be fed, or what's going on there?
Yeah, so this is Hong is oftentimes called China's Malthus, which is not fair because he's actually before Malthus, right? This idea that sort of all throughout human history we're stuck in this cycle where we get agricultural innovations that feed population growth, but then the population grows faster than we're able to feed it, and then because we don't have enough food, we have famine, we have war, and Malthus is saying that only the Industrial Revolution helps us escape that trap. So basically, Hong is sort of warning, he's giving that same warning that this era of peace and prosperity and growth has led to a huge population boom. But now that population can't feed itself anymore because it's moved to all the places where there's land to farm. It's settled all these territories. And so now, with no more land, really the only two choices are war and famine. And both of those things will happen in the coming decades.
Yeah.
So I have a question, and I'm fascinated about how you started because I had the same sort of fear was Opium War, Boxer Rebellion, that it's an external cause. And
yeah,
to what degree do you take a sort of a meta approach with your students and say, look, oftentimes there's been this Eurocentric or Western-centric perspective on how the narration, the colonizers have told the story.
yeah.
Do you talk about that? Because I think that would be something, and Eric, let me know if you think high school students would also be interested in saying, because I would do the same thing in U.S. history. This is how this story used to be taught, and here's why that's a problem, and here's how we want to look at it. Do you do that with your students?
Oh, absolutely. And the Opium Wars and the Treaty of Nanjing and these sort of unequal treaties are a great way to sort of do that because, well, we like to in the West make ourselves sort of the central characters or the driving agents of these stories. And in that narrative, we have this idea that the Qing is sort of unable to respond to these new challenges brought by the modern industrialized West. But in fact, the Qing is very flexible and a very good sort of navigator of all of these challenges, and they respond relatively well to the unequal treaty systems and the challenges of the Opium War. The thing that is much, much more difficult for the Qing to respond to are the domestic rebellions. And so this is really the second theme, that across the 19th century, we have these series of massive, massive domestic rebellions, things like the White Lotus Uprising, things like the Eight Trigram Uprising, and then most dramatically, of course, the Taiping Rebellion. I'm sure the Taiping Rebellion does not escape anyone's attention in a world history class. But these domestic rebellions are so large in scale and so spread out across the entire country that in order to suppress them, in order to quell the rebellions, the Qing has to empower local militias, has to empower sort of local leaders to take up arms and put down these rebellions on behalf of the central state. The capacity of the central state to do this is long stretched beyond what it's capable of doing. And so the big challenge for the Qing across the 19th century is Once it has empowered all of these local militias to suppress these rebellions, it can't take that power back. And so you have all across the country incredible dynamism, people making new institutions, all of these sort of efforts of industrialization, building railroads, arsenals, all the things that we think about. Again, if you're thinking of a world history comparative class, all the things that we say, oh my gosh, look at Meiji Japan, they're doing all this amazing industrialization. Well, the Qing is doing it too, just in a very different pattern of development, with local leaders funding these things on their own, taking control of these initiatives on their own, because of that pattern of domestic rebellion. That in order to quash the rebellions, the Qing has to empower local leaders, local militias, can't take that power back. And so, all or not all, a lot of the energy of reform and enthusiasm across the second half of the 19th century is happening locally. And so then, the start of the 20th century, when the Qing tries to centralize and nationalize all of those programs, so to buy up all of those railways that people had built provincially all around the country and make one national system, people revolt against that process, against the centralization, against the nationalization of their projects. And so the sort of big, sort of classical formulation that we get here, the sort of phrase that you can keep in mind to give to your students perhaps, is that at the end, it's the reforming elite who destroy the reforming regime. So across the second half of the 19th century, all around the country, you have elites who are making all of these reforms. Then, once the central state decides to reform itself, those local leaders say, no, 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 that's not for you. That's not for you to control. That's for us. And they revolt against the regime.
Were there any other fractures in the government? I know that there were. I seem to recall the corruption in the civil service examination. There are reform writers right around the Republic, Lu Xun, and so what other forces other than those like domestic resistance movements were there? Anything else? Those are fascinating. A lot, probably.
There's a lot else, but
Yeah.
actually, the contrast you just suggested there, besides the domestic rebellions, what else is there besides the domestic? That's actually my third point. That
Okay.
in addition to those long-standing domestic patterns and challenges from Hongliangji to those domestic rebellions, the Qing in the end of the 19th, early 20th century is just caught up in a wave of global revolutionary ideas. So by the end of the 19th century, there are a million different sort of schools of thoughts and ideologies that lead people to be anti-Qing for all sorts of different reasons. A lot of these revolutionary ideas, particularly, are taught, Chinese people are exposed to them studying in Japan. So after China loses, after the Qing loses the 1894-95 Sino-Japanese War, waves and waves of students go to study in Japan, and they're exposed to the most sort of up-to-date radical revolutionary ideas of the 19th century world. So two sort of quick examples that I like here. One is Zhou Rong, a young Chinese revolutionary who studies in Japan, comes back and writes this anti-Manchu tract called Revolutionary Army. And this is social Darwinism at its peak, right? Zhou Rong is writing that the Manchus are illegitimate because they're Manchu, right? So this is a anti-Manchu Han nationalist revolutionary fervor. Around the same time, there's another young student studying again in Japan by the name of Qiu Jin. She is exposed to sort of early wave feminist writing, and she comes back and she writes that the Qing needs to be destroyed not because they're Manchu, but actually because they are defenders of the Confucian patriarchy. So you can be anti-Qing, you can want to overthrow the Qing for a million different reasons in this period, because the Qing is both inheritor of long-standing domestic traditions and sort of patterns of change and challenges, but also is just in a whirlwind of social Darwinism, feminist ideas, all these sort of emergent revolutionary patterns that basically by the end, none of the, or very few of the revolutionaries agree with each other, except that they want to overthrow the Qing. So when we get all of these uprisings all across the country, really the only thing that unites all of the revolutionary activity is that they speak in a new language of rights and sovereignty, which is, of course, itself a product of the sort of Chinese exposure to new revolutionary traditions. But Revolutionary A and Revolutionary B are fighting the Qing for very different reasons, exposed to very different global ideas. But we can just all agree now at the end that the Qing has to go for one of those reasons or another.
Wow, that's so teachers are probably gonna have to listen to this podcast 4 or 5, 6 times.
Or enroll at Baylor.
Yeah, enroll at Baylor. But to come up with lessons, each one of those points that you make is a lesson in and of itself on the decline of the Qing. So I think it's great content. This is exactly what we're after. So thank you, Dan, for joining us today. Rob?
Yeah, it was. What a great and complex story that is exciting. I'm just thinking about the ways that it can be brought into a high school classroom. Thank you so much for joining us for a second time. It is deeply appreciated. And for those of you listening, stay tuned after this catchy little song, and we will share those lessons that will be developed in connection with Dr. Barish's comments. So have a great day, and thank you for being here.
Oh no, the clock is ticking, 20 minutes, time is spinning, pulling facts from thin air, hope they think I came prepared.
Listening to Dan Barish speak about the decline of the Qing Dynasty really made me rethink how to teach that time period. Thank you again to Dan. That was great. Well, there are so many possible lessons to create out of that podcast with regard to Dan's research. I developed a lesson, as Dan suggested, that asked students to understand the White Lotus and Taiping rebellions, along with intellectual rebellions in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Students will read some background information about each event or people as it pertains to intellectual movements, then rank the event that had the most influence on the decline of the Qing in order. Teachers, if you want to have some insights as to what your students are thinking, have them debate their rankings either in small groups or full class. Rob, what did you develop for the fall of the Qing, the last Chinese dynasty?
Geez, I kind of feel like I've shown up to prom and I'm wearing the same outfit as you, because my lesson is very similar to yours, but a little different. So I think it'll be okay. I was really struck by Dan's recommendation that teachers focus on the internal reasons for the Qing's decline and that they begin that story in the late 18th century with the warnings by the scholar Hong Longzhi. The students will read excerpts from 2 of his writings, one on corruption and one on population growth. Then they will make a hypothesis about which problem was more of a threat to Qing rule. To test that hypothesis, they will read brief accounts from the 3 rebellions, and the White Lotus Rebellion and the Taiping Rebellion are in there as well, during the 19th century in China.
Excellent, excellent. Yes, a very similar lesson. Teachers, you choose, depending upon your class. So thank you very much for listening. And remember, you can download your free lesson from the link provided in the episode notes. And please be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. And feel free to share feedback, especially whoever that listener is in Fiji. We really want you to reach out to us because we know you're listening and we appreciate it. Anyway, let us know what you're doing, what you think of these episodes. Hint, hint, we love the feedback.
And maybe we'll get invited to Fiji.
Maybe we will. Maybe we'll have some Fiji water.
All right.